Let me ask you a question. If you were an author and you had to write a story about a bunch of characters who have absolutely no hope in their lives, that constantly, day in and day out, struggle through substance abuse, all of the pleasures of the world that are immediately available to them, only for the spiral to go further and further down to the point where friendships get torn apart, lives are destroyed, and one's mind gets broken so hard to the point where reality and hallucinations are indistinguishable. How would you go about writing a character like that? Because there have been many stories in the past that have dealt with such nihilistic characters, but none have been as impactful, as brutal, as grotesque, and as disturbing as the ones in this book that I'm going to be talking about today. And that book is Almost Transparent Blue by Murakami. As you can see, this is the Kindle version because I was unable to find the original book because it is quite an old book. I believe it was written in the mid-70s by a very, very young Murakami Ryu. For those of you who don't know who Murakami Ryu is, I made a video a while back talking about one of his other books, Audition, which became a infamous, I would say, horror film by Takashi Miike. I did a whole review on that book and a lot of you guys enjoyed it, and a couple of you guys pointed me towards his first book, Almost Transparent Blue, or Kagiri naku toumei ni chikai blue. A name that I admittedly have heard before, but knew absolutely nothing about, so I was interested to dive into it. And knowing about its history as well as its subject matter for the most part got me very excited. Because truth be told, I do love my very depressing stories. I mean, if you know me, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. You know, my favorite manga of all time is Oyasumi Punpun, literally the manga that inspired and created a whole genre of depression manga. But the reason why I love stories like this and am fascinated by stories like this because, you know, I'm interested in people. I'm interested in the psychology of people, things like addiction, having known people in my life who have struggled through things like addiction in the past. It's always, yes, a depressing, but also a fascinating realm into the darker side of humanity. And let's just say, Almost Transparent Blue, this book, definitely doesn't fuck around with that topic whatsoever. Now, this is the part of the book review where I would start rattling off the plot of the book to get you guys interested in hopefully reading this particular novel. But with Almost Transparent Blue, it's kind of difficult for me to do so because, admittedly, there isn't really a plot to this book. I wouldn't say that it's plotless. There are definitely some progressions that happen throughout the story and within the characters, but it doesn't really lead to anywhere. I wouldn't even use the word progression in this instance. I would almost call it a regression. But essentially, the story is told mostly from the perspective of our main character, Ryu, who is a young kid, and all of his friends who engage in, I would say, some of the most brutal, raw, and just unadulterated debauchery imaginable. Like, you know that whole term sex, drugs, and rock and roll, fuck yeah? That lifestyle is definitely portrayed in this novel through the characters, but not in the fuck yeah type of way. It's more like the oh hell no type of way. Essentially, this book is 120 something pages, it is quite short, of witnessing Ryu and a bunch of his friends doing horrible things to themselves, all for the sake of nihilistic pleasure. I mean, the first chapter, if you can even call it that, because this book doesn't even have chapters, the book literally opens up with Ryu and a bunch of his friends listening to rock and roll in a filthy room somewhere in Japan. I believe they live on an American Air Force base, or like a Japanese town inside of an American Air Force base, and they're all just hanging out in this filthy apartment, shooting up heroin. Straight up. So right from the get-go, we have established that these characters are pretty down in the dumps. They are struggling with addiction. They are struggling with a nihilistic lifestyle, which I think is quite accurate and perfect for this kind of story when you understand the setting of this story. This is a story that was written in the 70s, set in the 1970s, in Japan. Now, one thing you need to understand about the 1970s in Japan, it was that it was kind of a dark time for especially a lot of the youths of Japan. This is post-war Japan, before the Great Economic Bubble, when the American Air Forces were coming to Japan, you know, that whole history. I'm not going to go into the details of it. You can do your own research on it. But the bottom line is, during the 1970s in Japan, a lot of the youth were very nihilistic. They didn't know where the country was headed, their futures were uncertain, and a lot of outside influences, like the rock and roll scene, had seeped into the youths of Japan. Mind you, this is also at the peak of the punk era, and Japan was definitely no exception to this. A lot of people might read this story and think, oh man, that's such an over-exaggeration. Like, people in Japan weren't doing this kind of stuff. Well, they kind of were. And reading a book like this retrospectively 50 years later really just goes to show how much Japan has changed for the better in some parts. But anyway, going back to the actual book, the entire story, if you can even call it that, is just a bunch of vignettes, essentially, of Ryu and his friends taking drugs, going to what they call these parties, which is essentially just a drug and sex-filled, almost orgy at times. In fact, there is a straight-up scene, or I guess quote-unquote chapter. I'm going to call it a chapter because I don't know how else to distinguish this. It's Ryu at a party with a bunch of his friends, and they're all high on a bunch of different substances. They're drinking a lot of alcohol, they're taking a lot of drugs. And it's this really disturbing scene of Ryu engaging in an orgy with an American soldier and I guess his partner or some associate. If you know anything about Ryu Murakami's writing, you'll know that he is incredibly good at really giving you a vivid image of what is happening. And this is no exception. Mind you, I read Audition in English, and that was my first foray into Ryu Murakami's works. With Almost Transparent Blue here, I read it in Japanese. So I read it in the intended language, the original language that this story was written in, and this is my first foray into the Japanese writing of Ryu Murakami, where there's no translator getting in the way. I say that as if it's a bad thing, but the English translation for Audition was actually quite brilliant, and I would still highly recommend it. But when you actually read a story like this in Japanese, it really just goes to show you how raw and unfiltered Ryu Murakami's writing is. He does not mince any words around in any way. It is just told straight up as it is. It's either incredibly literal or it's incredibly poetic, and there is no in-between whatsoever. And that's where I kind of want to talk about the writing in particularly this novel. And I think one of the genius things that Ryu Murakami did in this story that really puts you almost into the shoes of the main character, or in fact any of the characters. If you know anything about standard comprehension in a novel setting, then you'll know that when a character is talking, they'll use quotation marks, or I guess in the case with Japanese, these things called kagikakko, these things on screen right here. That's when you know that there is a character talking. Usually it's broken up after a line to indicate the end of a sentence, and if it doesn't strictly tell you that this particular character said it, then usually you can get it based on the context clues if you are following the story. Standard writing, 101, you don't need me to explain it. But what Ryu Murakami did with this particular novel especially is break that very basic rule of writing in a really unique and interesting way. It's not to say that Ryu Murakami doesn't use the Japanese equivalent of quotation marks when signifying that there is a speaker in the story. There are definitely parts in the book where he does this, but there are also a lot of parts in this book, especially during the party scenes, where there is just straight up paragraphs and blocks and blocks and blocks of dialogue, or words, I would say, not broken up into any lines whatsoever. It's just one after the other, after the other, after the other. It is not only describing the things that is happening in the particular scene, but it also includes dialogue of characters talking. Like, imagine taking any page out of any novel and getting rid of all the quotation marks, getting rid of all the line breaks, and the only thing separating each line is a comma or a full stop. That would seem really disorienting to read, right? Like, it would be really difficult for you to follow what the fuck is happening. Like, wait, so is something happening here, or is somebody talking, or is it both? Normally, any creative writer will tell you that that is a terrible way for you to present information in a story. Its only purpose is to just confuse the reader. But Ryu Murakami used this exact technique to give off a really interesting effect, in my opinion. See, these party scenes in Almost Transparent Blue, and there are multiple of these scenes, mind you, are very disorienting for the characters because they're all high on stuff. There is stuff happening in front of the characters that in a normal setting would be absolutely unbelievable. But by writing in this particular way, it almost puts the reader into the perspective of any of the characters at this party. It almost makes you feel just as disoriented, just as, I guess, confused as any of the people at this party who are high on substances and who are running to immediate sexual pleasures. Like, it's so crazy. I would read this particular portion of this party scene and I would be like, oh my god, there is so much happening all at once, and it completely shifts perspectives all the time. I'm struggling so hard to keep up with what is happening in this particular scene, almost like I'm participating in this very party that I'm trying to comprehend. I wouldn't even call it a fourth wall break, but it's this really amazing writing technique that really puts you into the situation. It really immerses you into being like, this is how it must feel like for these characters that I'm trying to comprehend and understand as a reader. Like, you know that whole thing of, in order to break the rules, you need to understand the rules? Well, Ryu Murakami, at a very young age, very much understood this role. And I think that's why this book was so highly praised in Japan and in the West. Not only is it an incredibly raw, vivid, and powerful allegory on young people going through horrendous nihilism about their lives and about society, but it's also showing in very poetic ways the scariness that is addiction. I think one of the other parts here that really struck a chord with me was right, I guess, near the end of the book. Ryu, our main character, goes through some pretty bad spiraling. It's never really fully explained what he's going through, but there are certain moments where he's talking about seeing a bird, seeing this big black bird that is, quote unquote, coming for him and coming for everybody. And he almost has this psychotic breakdown of these hallucinations that he's having, thinking that maybe it's an allegory to his life coming to an end. You know, the way that I took it is the big black bird is a crow, and usually in literature or poetry, a crow symbolizes death. But again, this is where Ryu Murakami does this really cool breaking of the rules of literature. There are so many moments where you're looking at Ryu, or looking through the eyes of Ryu through this hallucination mental breakdown, and you're not quite sure if what he's describing is actually the real world or the hallucinations that he's seeing. Because again, there is no clear indication that tells the reader this is a hallucination, or this part is actually happening in the real world. It's almost like you're being put into the shoes of the main character. You are just as confused as the character is, and that confusion really gets pushed onto the reader to really show the severity of the situation that the character is going through. The ending of this book, particularly, again, the mental breakdown that our main character goes through, is very open-ended in my mind. There have been lots of theories, lots of what-ifs that have been thrown around as to what happens to these characters. But again, as I mentioned near the beginning of the video, there isn't so much a progression, but rather a regression. It's characters that were already down in the dumps of nihilism going further down into this spiral. Some characters try to get their lives together, but the people around them tear them down, and that's what makes them tear down even further. It's the scariness of peer pressure, it's the scariness of being alienated from a community, no matter how terrible that community may be. And even though you may not have any experience going through this kind of horrendous nihilism or substance abuse or anything like that, I think that's a sentimentality that a lot of people can sympathize with. We don't want to be alienated from our own communities because, you know, at the end of the day, humans are social creatures. We want people around us to reinforce us. But if that community isn't there to help us at our lowest, or worse, if that very community is the thing that drags you down, then for some people, they think to themselves, well, what's even the point? All of this is portrayed in about 120 pages, which is insane to me. The fact that Ryu Murakami at such a young age was able to really portray this dreaded sense of nihilism at such a raw and unfiltered way at such a young age. I mean, there's no wonder that this book won the Akutagawa Award of Literature, which is literally like the highest form, or highest prize rather, that a Japanese literature can get. It's like winning the Pulitzer Prize, essentially. Now, I have seen a bunch of people on like Goodreads and, you know, other like book review sites saying that this book is overly edgy for the sake of being overly edgy. And I kind of have to disagree with that. Because yes, retrospectively reading this, some parts, especially if you don't fuck with stories like this, may come off a little bit edgy, may come off a little bit pretentious, may come off as a little bit, you know, grotesque just for the sake of being grotesque. But I think that that rawness and that grotesqueness and that quote-unquote edginess was done with a purpose. And that purpose was to show that there are young people who went through this during the 70s, and there are probably young people who are going through this today. Maybe not so much in Japan, I don't know, but, you know, say for example, in places like America with like the Fent crisis, for instance, yeah, there are people who are down in the dumps who don't think that life is worth living, and it's very difficult to get a full grasp on what those people are thinking. So maybe this is Ryu Murakami's way to show that yes, there are kids who are going through this kind of stuff, and it is a terrifying story, but I think it's a story that people need to hear and understand, because otherwise, we can't really help them. Another interesting point about this book that I saw was that a lot of people maybe think that some parts of this book may be somewhat autobiographical, considering the fact that the main character of the stories is also named Ryu. So maybe there's a little bit of Ryu Murakami's personal history thrown into it. Maybe he struggled from substance abuse at a young age. I guess someone in the comments can let me know. I'm not a Ryu Murakami expert, unfortunately. But bottom line is, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was an absolutely fascinating read that, again, incredibly short. I read it in like a couple of hours, and you guys can as well, because I believe there is an English translation of this book. And also I found out that there's like a film of this book as well, which I kind of struggle to believe, because I don't know how you can get a bunch of actors to agree to act out some of these scenes that I read, because it's pretty bad. It's like pretty gross. Again, especially the party scenes. There are some scenes that, my god, it was difficult to read at times, just trying to imagine what the hell these parties may consist of. I just can't fathom or imagine that being translated to screen without it being like an X-rated film. I don't know, I haven't seen the movie. Maybe one of you guys have seen it before, so I guess you can let me know if it's even worth checking out. I don't know if I would like recommend it to everybody. If you're feeling a little bit squirmish, for example, then maybe don't read this book. But if you're open to reading some incredibly image-heavy, vivid, yet raw and disturbing poetry, in a sense, then I would definitely recommend it. Check out Almost Transparent Blue by Ryu Murakami. But yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching. If you have any other books that you'd like me to read and talk about in videos like this, then let me know down in the comments below. And yeah, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to smack my face right here, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep making big channel number go bigger over here next to my head. A couple more videos you can check out if you enjoyed this one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Peace!